Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and today's episode is going to be an exploration of the question, why come out now? Before we get into that, I want to just remind you that you can get show notes for this episode as well as all the previous episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com. You can also send me feedback at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or submit audio feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. You can also exchange ideas with others in our public Facebook fan page or in our private Facebook group. So before we talk about coming out now, we need to acknowledge that, especially for those of you who are baby boomers like me or even older, we came of age at a time when coming out was not common. In fact, it was unknown when I was a young person. Everyone was in the closet because they didn't have any choice. Back in the early days of what was then called the gay civil rights movement, one of the leaders of the movement, named Dor Legg, said that, and this is according to Lillian Faderman's History, the Gay Revolution, Dor Legg said we had four enemies that were like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. These were lack of social acceptance, because at that time, and this was around 1960, not being straight was not socially acceptable. There was also the problem of the scientific, or I prefer to call it pseudoscience, that said that being homosexual was a mental illness. The reason I call this pseudoscience is because even at the time that homosexuality was put in the very first psychiatric diagnostic and statistical manual known as the DSM, which was a book that was supposed to have all the psychiatric illnesses in it. In 1952, when that was done, they already had the Kinsey report. They were already ignoring the evidence. And then Evelyn Hooker also put her evidence out in the early 50s. It was slightly after 52, but still, it was until 1973 that homosexuality was removed from the DSM. So we see a great deal of politics going on there. And it's beyond the scope of today's conversation to discuss why the DSM is, in my opinion, lacking in scientific merit. But as I said, that's not what this show is about. The third horseman is religion, because at the beginning of the LGBT civil rights movement, it was almost universally considered that homosexuality was a sin, an evil. That's still, a very dominant viewpoint among many different faith communities. The fourth horseman was legal. It was illegal to be gay, essentially. You could get put in jail. You could lose your job. You could have your life ruined. All these things work together to make it so that coming out just wasn't something people did. So those things, lack of social acceptance, the pseudoscience idea that it was a mental illness, religious teachings, and our legal lack of rights, all these things contributed to people staying in the closet. So this means that the idea that you should come out is a relatively new one. Back in the 70s, when Harvey Milk, as we talked about a couple weeks ago with Lillian Faderman, back when he was arguing that people should come out, that was still a pretty new idea, and that was in the 1970s. Of course, that's 40 years ago now, but from a long-range standpoint, that's not very long. So for this show, the idea of coming out later in life, one thing is that the whole idea of later in life, sort of a moving target. If you talk to a young person, they think the 20s is later in life. Or maybe the most common thing I hear is the idea that 30s and 40s are later in life, whereas because I'm 63, I think it's greater than 50. I am happy that this show is attracting listeners of all these age groups. But it has to be recognized that our perspectives on this is going to be different according to what decade we came of age. So let's talk about the pros and cons of coming out now, later in life, whatever later in life means to you. The biggest reason that people give for coming out is so that they can embrace their whole selves and be authentic. Obviously, you've probably already read or heard long descriptions about the discovery of one's authenticity after coming out. However, I would say that even if you're only at the coming out to yourself stage, you can still get some benefits of discovering your authenticity. However, one of the things that you won't get if you're only out to yourself is the other advantage, which is not wasting so much energy covering up who you really are. That's why so many people, after they come out, enter entirely new phases of creativity and productivity in their lives because they didn't realize how much energy was being consumed, as they would probably say, living a lie. Then, to me, one of the reasons that I wanted to come out was for the chance to join the larger LGBT community. And I have to admit that this has proven more challenging than I expected, but I still think it's valid, and I hope that we will work together to create a supportive community and then help each other to determine how we get into the larger community. The final reason that I would list as a pro is that we help straight people understand that we're just people. I mean, that's what Harvey Milk argued for. We would be teaching people that we're just their neighbors. People used to think that they didn't know any gay people. They would say, I don't know anybody gay, even though it wasn't true, because the people in their lives that were gay were very, very closeted. Today, the situation is that people are saying they don't know anybody that's transgendered. That's probably not true either, but that's kind of where things stand for that community at this point in time. So most of the reasons for coming out are highly personal. However, that last reason really is a political act, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Now, obviously, there are cons. That's why coming out's not easy. One thing is the whole unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't predict how the people in your life are going to react. And if there's one thing that all the stories I've heard so far since I started doing this show, if there's one thing they all have in common, is that they're full of surprises. The people that they expected to be supportive maybe weren't, and the people they expected not to be affirming surprised them. But bottom line is people worry, quite rightly, about losing family and friends. This is a very valid concern, has to be acknowledged. Erica Anderson said that when she came out, she faced the possibility that she would lose everything. And actually what she did lose turned out to be professional. But the point is she had to be willing to face those losses. Then there's the religious community. If you're part of a faith community that's important to you, you may be facing the loss of that community and maybe even rejection by that community. I have to heartfeltly acknowledge that because I wasn't a member of a faith community when I came out, and I intentionally chose Unitarian Universalism as my faith community a couple years ago because I knew that it was an affirming, accepting community. I'm going to try to get some guests on the show coming up. I just haven't been able to find the right guests yet. That's the only reason why I haven't done it yet. But I'm working on getting some guests that can address these issues from a position of actual experience, since I don't have any experience in this area. Of course, safety can be a concern. And I'm starting with the assumption that coming out doesn't present a risk of physical danger or harm. If you live in a country where it's illegal to be gay and the penalty is death, then coming out publicly makes no sense. You would just be playing into the hands of the enemy. They could wipe everybody out, right? So most of what I'm saying is assuming that you're in a situation where you could actually safely come out. If you aren't, you do the best you can, just like LGBT people have always done. I want to talk about the advantages of coming out later in life. Now, obviously, we could argue there are some disadvantages, like it's kind of hard to meet someone. But, we can't go back and turn back the clock and do it when we were young. So talking about the disadvantages of waiting is not going to do anybody any good. But there are a few advantages to coming out when you're already mature. First of all, you probably already know who you are. So you're not going to be going through the problem of the adolescent young person coming out who doesn't even know who they are as a person yet. I think most of us have already got a pretty good sense of who we are, and who we are is going to get bigger and better when we come out. We're not going to change to a different person. Also, you're probably already established in your profession, or perhaps you're even retired. So those concerns are less pressing. Your reputation is established. Outside of the religious context, people's opinion of you are unlikely to change very much. You'll probably have people that go, yeah, fine, I thought you were gay all along, I want to share in the context of how people's opinions won't change. I want to share a story from my own youth way back in 1979. Way back in 1979, when I was about 22 years old, I was playing on a fast-pitch softball team. I was still straight, and of course I knew that there were some women on the team that were lesbian. I assumed the ones that I would call butch or dykes, that they were gay, but I didn't realize that it was possible to be a feminine lesbian. So we went to a tournament where we didn't play for very long and ended up going to a gay bar. And I realized that probably everyone on the team except for me was gay. I recognized the lesson, even though I was only 22, because I saw, okay, I've already made my opinions about I like that person, I don't like that person. Some of the people that I liked, I'd known were gay, some I didn't know, but I didn't change who I liked or I didn't like, and I realized it doesn't matter. And that was even though I had just come out of Jehovah's Witnesses, a fairly fundamentalist religion, but at that time they really weren't wasting any energy on condemning homosexuality. But they were very Bible-based, so I'm sure they would have. So now, getting back to the topic of why coming out now is a political act. I don't need to tell any of you, even if you're not in the United States, you know that the election of Donald Trump has unleashed those who want to erase the recent gains made by the LGBT community. But the good news is that 2 of those horsemen have already been slain. It's now socially acceptable to be LGBT among most people outside of the religious right. And science and medicine have also recognized that sexual and gender diversity are universal. We even see same-sex sex in animals. And from what I've read, I think that they think the incidence in animals is about 10%, which is still higher than the number of people who usually identify as gay, which makes me think that people are still underreporting. Now, obviously, the religious battle is ongoing, but the more that LGBT people of faith stand up within their own particular faith traditions, that's the only way that progress can be made. There is within the traditions. They have no reason to listen to anyone outside of their belief system. So I have a great deal of respect for those who are working in this area. And if I didn't mention it before, I really want to mention this great podcast I discovered very recently called Queerology, which is about the intersection of Christianity and obviously being queer. I highly recommend that to anyone who is struggling with this faith part of the question. So legally, that's where we've got a lot to lose, and it's the reason why we can't afford to just keep our heads down or to go back into the closet. The majority of straight people, I think, realize that allowing same-sex marriage has not hurt them personally or brought the world to an end, and they can see the benefits that it's bringing to their LGBT friends. But they wouldn't know this if their friends were all in the closet. They only know it because the people are out, and they know these people as individuals. And it's not unusual for them to be in a situation where they still think it's wrong, but they can accept that one individual couple, per se, because that's just human nature. But it's a step in the right direction. One reason why the transgender members of our community are still being targeted by the religious right is that they can take advantage of the fact that people still think they don't know any transgender people. But that's where the safety issue really comes in. If you're a transgender male or female and you're successfully passing in your chosen gender, this might not be the best time to come out. I'm a cisgender female, so my advice or opinions about this aren't really valid. But I think for those of us that identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual or queer or whatever, we need to ask ourselves if we really can afford to stay in the closet. Younger people are already more accepting of sexual and gender diversity. But among older people, the key predictor of whether or not they are accepting is whether they personally know a person of the LGBT community. And that's where you come in. You might be the first openly LGBT person that one of your friends, family, neighbor, or whatever meets or knows that they've known. Silence has never really been our friend. It was a time when it was the only way to survive. But the times have changed, and I feel strongly that the ongoing acceptance of our community by our fellow citizens, or them recognizing us as just being fellow citizens, human beings, it requires that we not only stick up for our rights, but that we also allow our fellow citizens to see us as we really are, which they can only do if we come out. Now, one of the advantages of maturity is the perspective one gains with age. We stop and ask ourselves, is this a battle worth fighting? And what can I do to make things better for those who come after me? When you're young, you don't really think much about the people coming up behind you. But as you get older, this becomes a priority, even if you don't have children and grandchildren to worry about. I mean, that's the reason I decided to start the Graying Rainbows podcast. Coming out LGBT later in life in this particular moment represents its own unique opportunities and challenges. Unless the religious right succeeds in erasing us again, 30 years from now, coming out later in life is likely to be quite rare. Of course, given the realities of sexual and gender fluidity, it's not going to disappear completely because there's always going to be people who just don't discover or they change. So I want to think about these challenges and opportunities that are unique for us. Of course, the challenge is there's so much unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, and that's scary. We don't know how bad things are going to get under Trump. And we don't know what our family and friends are going to do until we actually come out. And fear of the unknown can be a big paralyzer. But I think as we get older, we should hopefully gain more confidence that we can survive the unknown. We can survive things that don't go as expected. Another challenge we face is that there is no clear path about how to do this. There's never been a time in history that exactly matched our own, where there's a large number of us in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, probably beyond. I've heard stories of people coming out in their 90s. If you can get me one of those people that's in their 90s on the show, that'd be fantastic. This is a unique time in history, but there's no clear path about what we should do. And the potential losses in terms of family and friends, they're very, very real. But I prefer to focus on opportunity, the chance to live your life in its fullest authenticity, the chance to maybe find that special person that you can love in a way that you were never able to do before, the chance to be a role model for somebody else, an inspiration for somebody else. Maybe you come out and people in your life that you never imagined come out too. I bet you if you come out, someone else will too. In my mind, this is not just about doing what's best for ourselves. It's about doing something that can help other people. Even if you see coming out as being something that will be painful to those in your life who maybe think it's wrong, and so you're worried about, I can't say you're not going to hurt them, but even for them, the lessons that they can learn can make a difference in the future. Maybe it takes them many years to come around and accept you for who you are, but maybe that helps the next person in their life that needs that acceptance. Finally, I just think right now in 2019, we have to stand up against bigotry and hatred. Back when I was a kid, especially in the 60s, reading about World War II and Nazism, part of me said, well, how did that happen? How were the Nazis able to convince people to hate the Jews and be okay with murdering them, trying to wipe out a whole people? How could that happen? Of course, I realized it wasn't that simple. There was a lot of propaganda and misinformation going on, just like there is now. But I used to ask myself, would I have had the courage to stand up against that? And I always kind of thought that the answer was probably no. I felt bad because I thought that the answer might be no. Now, I'm not comparing what's going on now to fascism, although there are moments going on in our current events that are scarily reminiscent of fascism. I think we've got to stand up. And that doesn't mean, sending tweets to who. It just means being authentically yourself in your real life, because that's one person at a time. That's my take on it. I'd love to hear what you think. Please do post comments on our Facebook fan page or send me email at grainrainbows@gmail.com. You can also get something going if you're on Twitter. It's the Grain Rainbows Twitter account is graying capital R. Also, you can do voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. If you can only remember one thing, visit grainrainbows.com where I've got links to everything. I really appreciate you listening. I've got some great episodes coming up, so I'll be back to talk with you again in a couple of weeks. Grain Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.